Thank you all for coming to my lecture about the forced repatriation of North Korean refugees escaping through Southeast Asia. I really appreciate the audience for coming today and listening to this talk, and I'd appreciate if you would save any questions or comments for the end. So before I begin, I would like to pose a question to the audience. When you think of North Korea, what is one or two words that come to mind?
Prison state. Or weapons of mass closed off.
Closed off. Weapons of mass destruction. Communism. What else? Hermit kingdom. Okay, yeah. All of those are really great answers, and I expected most of those answers because especially when talking about North Korea, those are the things we typically focus on, especially nuclear weapons. But, for me, the word that comes to mind is people. Bordering one of the most economically prosperous countries in the world, South Korea, lies a destitute country of over 26 million people living under a repressive totalitarian regime. Under such a society, the only thing that people can do is to escape, many of whom hope to make it to South Korea. But when they do escape, rather than being welcomed with open arms by the nearby community, they often face a fear of forced repatriation from the countries that they're escaping through, namely China, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. This project was originally created for Dr. Santoli's IWP Peace, Conflict, and Resolution course, which I took last year. And in that class, he asked each student to create a solution to a real-world problem. On my mind at the time was a documentary that I had seen called Beyond Utopia. This captured the real-life dangers of a North Korean family that was attempting to escape through Southeast Asia, and it showcased the fears that they had of being captured and sent back, but also the relief when they finally made it to South Korea. This film touched me so much that for this project, I came up with a framework for a UN resolution that I believe can address the issue of forced repatriation. And I hope that maybe just one person in the audience today can gain something from my lecture and we can work towards a resolution. In order to understand the North Korean human rights issue and what's forcing people to escape, you must first understand its government and its leadership style. North Korea is a totalitarian dictatorship ruled by a family known as the Kims, beginning with Kim Il-sung, the founder, in 1948, his son, Kim Jong-il, who took power in 1994, and his son, Kim Jong-un, who took power in 2011. Currently, Kim Jong-un rules with the title of Suryung, also known as Supreme Leader. The Suryung is based on a mixture of Confucian principles and Juche ideology. Author Victor Cha says that there are 4 tenets of Juche ideology. Man is the master of his fate. The master of the revolution is the people. The revolution must be self-reliant. And the key to all of this is absolute loyalty and obedience to the Suryung, Kim Jong-un. Essentially, the Suryung system has facilitated the unchecked violation of human rights in the country. Furthermore, in North Korea, there is a legally enshrined class-based discrimination system called the Songbun system. This is where citizens are ranked based on gender, religion, political opinions, and family history. This places each citizen into 3 categories, as you can see here. The core class at the very top, these are considered people that are loyalists to the Kim regime, and they're typically granted better services and better living standards. The middle is the wavering class. These are citizens whose commitment to the regime is seen sort of suspect, but they typically have to go through a number of ideological indoctrination sessions, and they're still seen as viable economic assets. And the last is the hostile class. These are people with a record of opposition to the government, or they have family with a record of opposition to the government, or they're descendants of so-called class enemies. These people are under constant surveillance, not only by the state, but by one another. The majority of society in North Korea falls under the hostile class. On the background of these two systems, in 2014, the United Nations Human Rights Council had released a report called the Report of the Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, also known as the 2014 COI report. The 2014 report found 9 specific human rights violations. Violations to the right of food, violations associated with prison camps, torture and mistreatment, arbitrary arrests and detention, discrimination, in particular in the systematic denial and violation of basic human rights and fundamental freedoms, violations of the right of expression, violations of the right to life, violations of the freedom of individual movement, enforced disappearances, including in the form of abductions of nationals of other states, particularly South Korea, and potential crimes against humanity. This report is important because the human rights violations found then are still the same that's going on today. Despite this, the North Koreans are often considered only as defectors by the international community, or economic migrants by China, or even illegal migrants by Thailand. And although these terms may be correct for some of the North Korean escapees, as many do consider themselves defectors, I believe that only binding them to such definitions ignores the human rights abuses and the legally enshrined class-based discrimination that the majority of them face, which is why I am referring to them as refugees. The UN definition of a refugee is, quote, someone who has left their country of origin due to circumstances that have seriously disrupted public order and require international protection. These circumstances can include feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence, war, hunger, extreme poverty, sexual or gender orientation, consequences of climate change or other natural disasters, end quote. And if one is granted refugee status under the UN system, then they are also granted what is known as non-refoulement or non-repatriation under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, meaning that these surrounding states, since they're in the UN system, they should not be forcibly repatriating them. Furthermore, North Koreans can also be considered refugees sur place as well. These are those who are not considered refugees when they left their country, but become refugees at a later date because of a well-founded fear of persecution upon return. And this persecution upon return is key. North Koreans who are forcibly sent back after trying to escape are subjected to torture, imprisonment, forced labor, sexual persecution, and they may be thrown in gulags or even killed to be made an example of for the rest of society not to try it. I would say these people definitely have a well-founded fear of persecution upon return, wouldn't you? Despite this, North Korean refugees' status is quite ambiguous in the UN system. This is for a few reasons. One of the main reasons is that South Korea claims that any citizen born on the peninsula is automatically a South Korean citizen. So that means that North Koreans technically have dual citizenship, which means that the other surrounding states can get away with not viewing them as refugees once they are outside of North Korea, since they technically have South Korean citizenship. Also, since North Korea itself is recognized as a sovereign state by the United Nations, then South Korea can only provide legal refugee diplomatic protection only when they are inside of South Korea. Another aspect is that some countries, like China, also have their own human rights issues. China refuses to acknowledge the North Koreans' plight because if they do so, they would have to turn inward and acknowledge their own human rights abuses against the Uyghur minorities. And they do not want neighboring states taking in Uyghurs as refugees. Therefore, they do not want North Koreans to be seen as refugees as well. But if we take a look at even just one North Korean's testimony, you will see why they deserve refugee status. In the next slide, I'll play a video of a woman telling her story of escaping North Korea.
저는 김은주이고요. 1999년에 북한에서 이제 고난의 행군 시기일 때 북한을 탈출을 했어요. 저는 함경북도 운덕에서 1986년도에 태어났어요. 근데 운덕이 김일성과 김정일의 은혜와 덕을 입어서 이제 운덕이라고 이름이 변경된 거고 지금은 또 바뀌었거든요. 근데 그 전에는 사람들이 되게 한국에서도 평양다음으로 유명한 아오지예요. 바로 그래서 6.25 한국 포로들을 이제 아오지 탄광에 많이 배치를 했었거든요. 북한 정권이. 그래서 거기에 탄광에서 일하시는 분 중에 진짜 북한 포로들이 있었어요. 네, 그래서 그 지역에서 그냥 사실 그 지역이 못 사는 곳인지 잘 사는 곳인지에 대한 개념도 없이 이제 살다가 90년대 중반에 고난의 행군이 닥치면서 거기에서 제일 많은 사람들이 죽어나갔거든요. 그때 알았던 것 같아요. 아, 내가 살고 있는 이곳이 북한 사회 중에서도, 북한의 지역 중에서도 가장 살기 힘든 곳이구나. 사실 한 7, 8살까지는 배고픈 거를 모르고 살다가 그 이후에 이제 학교에 갔다가 집에 오는 길에 빈혈을 느껴서 이제 대열에서 이탈해가지고 멍 때리고 서 있었던 적이 있거든요. 근데 그 순간에 아, 우리는 못 사는구나. 우린 가난하구나. 그때 초등학교 3학년이었나? 2학년이었나? 그때 그걸 느꼈던 것 같아요. 그 이후로 점점 상황이 안 좋아져서 아빠가 이제 영양실조로 돌아가시고 저희가 한 1년 정도 라진 선봉이라는 곳에서 꽃제비, 거지, 뭐 그런 생활을 하다가 중국에 가면 사탕 과자는 배부르게 먹을 수 있단다. 이 이야기를 엄마가 이제 지인으로부터 들었고 진짜 그 딱 하나 정보 가지고 엄마가 여기서 굶어 죽을 바에는 이제 두만강 건너다 총에 맞아 죽자. 그러니까 시도라도 해보자, 살아보자 라고 하셔가지고 엄마 따라서 이제 99년 2월 18일 네. 근데 이제 저희는 두만강이 꽁꽁 얼었을 때 이제 탈북을 했거든요. 왜냐하면 두만강 하류 쪽이어서 두만강이 폭이 100m 넘었었어요. 그래서 수영을 해서 한번 시도했다가 실패하고 이제 얼었을 때 이제 다시 이제 걷는 건데 엄마가 앞에 서고 언니가 가운데 서고 제가 제일 뒤에 있었는데 하필이 마음이 그래서 그런지 몰라도 신발이 너무 미끄러운 거예요. 그래서 계속 넘어지고 하는데 엄마 언니는 저기서 앞에서 막 가고 있고 이러다가 나 혼자 잡히는 거 아닌가라는 생각도 있었는데 사실 엄마 언니도 그런 생각을 했을 거예요. 사실은 북한에서 이제 탈북을 해서 잡혀오면 엄중한 처벌 받는다는 정도는 알고 있었거든요. 그리고 우리가 이제 두만강을 건널 때 총을 쏜다는 이야기도 들었고 그래서 엄청 두려웠죠. 근데 이제 이 길이 아니면 살 길이 없으니까 어떤 사람들은 뭐 잘한 선택이다 뭐 탈북했다 그러면 선택 잘하셨어요 뭐 이런데 사실 우리한테는 선택의 길이 아니라 유일한 살 길이었어요. 그래서 이제 중국으로 가게 된 거고 중국에서 많은 탈북 여성들이 그런 것처럼 이제 강제 임신매를 저희도 이제 겪어야 했어요. 근데 엄마가 이제 중국 남성한테 팔려갈 때 저희가 이제 딸려간 거죠. 그래서 다행히 이제 중국의 임신매매를 겪긴 했지만 같이 살 수 있었고 그러다가 한 3년 후에 중국 공안한테 잡혀서 이제 강제 북송되었다가 또 막 긴 이야기지만 거기에서 우여곡절 끝에 다시 탈북을 했어요. 그게 2002년에 재탈북해서 중국에서 이제 살다가 사실 북한을 탈출할 때는 진짜 배고파서 먹을 걸 위해서 탈북을 했어요. 근데 중국에서 살면서 먹을 거는 해결되었거든요. 또 뭐 개, 돼지도 쌀밥 먹고 옥수수 먹었으니까. 근데 인간다운 삶은 아니었던 거죠. 항상 경찰이 중국 공안이 언제 이제 잡으러 올지 모르다 보니 공안차가 사이렌만 울려도 심장이 자동으로 벌렁벌렁 뛰고 밤에 자다가 강아지가 막 짖기만 하면 그냥 앞뒤 안 가지고 산으로 도망가고 그런 삶이 너무 힘들다 보니까 이제 또 그런 와중에 한국에 가면 신분이 이제 보장되는 삶을 살 수 있다 이런 이야기를 듣고 탈북을 결심해서 2006년 말에 이제 대한민국 서울에 정착을 했습니다. 근데 한국에 와서 저희가 엄마랑 제가 2006년도 말에 이제 먼저 정착하고 언니는 2008년도 중순에 왔거든요. 2년 정도 뒤에. 그때 진짜 학교 갔다가 집에 그 올라가는 엘리베이터 누를 때 심장이 진짜 바운스였어요. 자동으로 그 해피 바이러스가 뭔가 그때가 진짜 뭔가 몸으로 느껴졌던 것 같아요. 그런 행복감이라고 해야 될까? 만족감이라고 해야 될까? 설레임. 집에 들어가면 엄마가 언니가 기다리고 있다는 그런 것들. 그래서 그리고 예전에 꿈이 그 중국에 있을 때는 그 돈이 없었던 건 아니에요. 물 한 병 사 먹을 돈이 없었던 건 아닌데 뭐가 살 수 있는 돈이 없었던 건 아닌데 되게 아꼈었어요. 지금 저희 엄마도 되게 구두쇠여가지고 벌기는 하는데 자기 위해서 잘 쓰지 않으시거든요. 근데 그때도 좀 이렇게 일해서 식당에서도 일하고 해서 벌었는데 대형 마트에 가면 기껏해야 물 한 병 사가지고 나오는 거였어요. 저희가. 그래서 그때 꿈이 마트에 가서 카트에 가득 뭔가 사보고 싶었던 거였거든요. 중국에서. 근데 언니 오고 이러면서 엄마랑 제가 있을 때는 또 그렇게 많이 살 일도 없었는데 2년 후에 언니가 오고 나서 저희 가족 3명이 이제 합치고 나서는 우리가 바랬던 거를 다 이뤘던 것 같아요. 그리고 그때 시간들이 가장 행복했던 것 같아요. 진짜. 이런 이야기, 내 이야기를 계속 하면서 북한과 그 북한에 있는 내 친구, 가장 친했던 친구 이름이 선아인데 그 친구가 한국에 안 온 것 같아요, 아직. 그래서 그 친구를 생각하면 선아도 나처럼 대학도 다니고 하고 싶은 것도 할 수 있고 이 넓은 세상을 경험하고 돌아다니고 할 수 있는데 거기에 갇혀서 아직도 저 어둠 속에 있구나라는 생각을 하면서 뭔가를 난 계속 해야 된다라는 그런 책임감을 오히려 이야기하면서 더 강하게 느끼는 것 같아요. 의무감이라던가 책임감을 내 이야기를 하면서 스스로 더 강화시키게 되는 것 같아요. 제가 꿈꾸는 삶은 북한인권 활동하거나 이런 건 아니에요. 그럼에도 불구하고 북한에 있는 내 친구 선아가 나랑 비슷한 삶을 살 수 있을 때까지 난 계속해서 이야기를 해야 된다라고 스스로 생각을 하게 된 것 같습니다.
So it's refugee testimonies like Unju's that prove not only the well-founded fear of persecution that they have, but also the fear of being repatriated when they journey through countries like China. But also, even when they journey through countries like China and they're trafficked, they still have a fear of being caught from that hell and sent back to another. So how do North Koreans generally escape? You can see here, there's a map. Typically, they go through what is called the Asia's Underground Railroad. And these include going from North Korea to northern China, to Laos, to Thailand, or North Korea to northern China, to Vietnam, to Cambodia, or North Korea to northern China, to Mongolia. And you see northern China is key here. So the countries that I focus on particularly in this is China, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. I think all of them play the biggest role in the forced repatriation issue, especially since China, Vietnam, and Laos have all previously repatriated North Korean refugees. The situation that we're facing now is one in which many scholars believe that Southeast Asian countries are no longer reliable partners in the North Korean human rights crisis. And I think this is unfortunate, but it has room to be changed. First, beginning with China. When refugees are escaping, the area that most first go through is northeastern China to either the Jilin or the Liaoning provinces, or the Yanbian Korean Autonomous Region, as you can see here on the map. This is because this area houses a lot of ethnic Koreans who are nationally Chinese, but also because it's right on the border. But unfortunately, due to China's one China policy of the past, there's an excess of men over women, particularly in these rural areas of northeastern China, which is why many women, like Unju and her family, are actually trafficked into the villages and forced into marriages or sex work through the brokers that were actually claiming to help them escape. In 2014, the COI report was really the first time that China's forced repatriation of North Koreans was highlighted internationally. The chairman of the report actually attached a letter stating that China could be aiding and abetting crimes against humanity by forcibly repatriating North Koreans. And since China actually considers all North Korean refugees as economic migrants, they claim to not be breaking any UN conventions by repatriating them. However, the UN HRC handbook clarifies the difference between economic migrants and refugees. One who flees even for economic measures due to direct discrimination based on racial, religious, or political aims or intentions directed against a particular group should be considered a refugee and not an economic migrant. The Songbun system and other known human rights violations, as I've mentioned already, prove the discrimination that the majority of them face, which is why they should not be considered economic migrants. But no matter what, China has 3 bilateral treaties with North Korea, which actually forms the basis of its consistent repatriation. And because of this, recently, in May 2024, China actually forcibly repatriated 60 North Korean refugees from the Jilin and the Liaoning provinces back to North Korea. Since China has substantial ties with North Korea, it will most likely not change its policies on repatriation. However, I believe the other states, Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, they have more room for the international community to work with on these repatriation laws. For Vietnam, in 2019, Vietnam actually had a bit of a re-engagement period with North Korea. Kim Jong-un had visited. North Korea actually allowed a show called The Amazing Race Vietnam to shoot a segment in Pyongyang. Then a month after, President Trump and Kim Jong-un met in Hanoi, and then Vietnam decided to deport 3 North Korean refugees. During this period, Liberty in North Korea, which is a human rights group that actually made the video on Unju, their leader, Sokyo Park, said, quote, "I am worried that Kim Jong-un's diplomatic engagement with Vietnam could have influenced them to deport the North Korean refugees," end quote. Park had also partially blamed South Korea as well, stating, quote, "South Korea failed to respond promptly to a request to help the refugees after they were arrested in Vietnam," end quote. And this is significant since it's not the first time and not the only time that South Korean embassy in Hanoi has been accused of not actually helping the refugees. Historically, Vietnam is actually known to only deport the North Korean refugees back to China. But as noted before, China will just send them back to North Korea. But Vietnam has also historically been willing to give South Korea a chance to claim the refugees. But after multiple alleged instances of being shrugged off by the South Korean embassy in Hanoi, it seems as though the government officials are now mostly keeping to the route of deporting them back to China. Despite these issues, I do think that it's significant that Vietnam has never sent any of the refugees directly back to North Korea. And I think that the international community can exploit this to better the process of getting the refugees to South Korea or other willing nations. Laos. Laos actually used to be considered sort of a safe haven for North Korean refugees. Basically, they would turn a blind eye if you could bribe officials and you had help from brokers to get through the country. But this all changed in May 2013 with the Laos 9 incident. In May 2013, the Laos government had detained 9 North Korean refugees, all of whom were orphans between the ages of 15 and 23. They detained them for, quote, traveling without documents. And then they returned them to North Korea, actually claiming that they were trafficking victims. But the brokers who had helped them get through Laos and other human rights organizations continued to refute this. And this was actually the first time that Laos had repatriated North Koreans, and they got huge international backlash. But despite this, in 2016, Laos and North Korea signed a secret bilateral treaty, which is rumored to have a repatriation clause. However, despite the rumored repatriation clause, luckily we haven't seen any headlines of Laos actually repatriating North Koreans since 2013. Not to say that they aren't doing so, but I do believe if they were, the human rights groups and the brokers would be speaking out like they did before. And so I do think that this offers a chance for the international community as well to work with Laos, since it's been so long since they've actually repatriated North Koreans. And lastly, Thailand. 90% of North Korean refugees actually end their journey in Southeast Asia in Thailand. And what happens is these North Korean refugees will willingly turn themselves into Thailand authorities, who then consider them illegal migrants. They'll jail them in a detention center for a short period before handing them over to South Korean authorities. And that's actually what was shown in Beyond Utopia. For Thailand itself, though, the jailing of the refugees is a time and a resource-consuming process. But rather than having a direct line with South Korea to just send these refugees there immediately, they jail them first and they file them under illegal migrant status due to pressure from Chinese. And also, Thailand does not want to officially recognize North Koreans as refugees for fear of them flooding into the country. However, of all the countries, I think Thailand is still the most safe and consistent Southeast Asian state today, at least for North Korean refugees seeking to make it to South Korea. And they don't have a record of repatriating North Koreans back. Although recently, Thailand did repatriate 40 Uyghurs back to China. So I fear that this could be changing, but I believe that they still may be willing to be involved in an international movement to continue getting these refugees, North Korean ones at least, to South Korea or other countries willing to take them. So given this issue of North Korean escapees facing forced repatriation on their journey to freedom through Southeast Asia, I propose that there should be a UN General Assembly Human Rights Council resolution that both clarifies the status of North Korean escapees as refugees or refugees surplace, and creates an international body known as the Committee on the Resettlement of North Korean Refugees. This will coordinate the removal of the refugees from Southeast Asia to South Korea or other countries willing to take them, and it will encourage Southeast Asian countries not to repatriate them. Within the body of the text, I think there should be a central section that establishes a first asylum program for the North Korean refugees, in which the arrangements would be negotiated with the countries in the region to essentially just provide very temporary asylum to the refugees, assuring that they will be permanently resettled elsewhere in a timely manner. And the main point of the resolution is really the fact that Southeast Asian countries are already sending them back to China and North Korea using their own resources. So if we as the international community can create an alternative streamlined process for sending the North Korean refugees to South Korea or other country or other willing countries, then I think it would create more of a smooth, cheaper, streamlined process, and some of these Southeast Asian countries may be willing to be a part of it. I believe that a UN resolution is also the best option for a couple of reasons. First, the United Nations, as I mentioned before, does have a precedence of reports and resolutions on North Korean human rights. And a UN resolution is also broader. I think it holds more weight internationally, as multiple countries do have the chance to be signatories. And it allows countries to actually agree to try and solve the issue without a legally binding element. It keeps the pressure off, since a lot of these states are actually being kept in check by both China and North Korea's influence in the region. And if even just one state, such as Vietnam, Laos, or Thailand, or even China, or we would hope and pray, signs this resolution, it would be a significant advancement in the North Korean human rights crisis. For example, suppose the refugees get safely through China, and they go straight to Vietnam. If Vietnam was a signatory to this treaty, rather than having to travel further through Laos and to get to Thailand to then turn themselves into authorities, the refugees would have the chance to approach Vietnamese authorities, who would then get in contact with the Committee on the Resettlement of North Korean Refugees, which would then coordinate their extradition to South Korea or other countries who are willing to take them. And since Vietnam itself already has a history of sending them back to China using their own resources, I think allowing an independent third body to step in and send them to another country should create a smoother and cheaper process for Vietnam, in which they would use less of their own state resources to deal with the North Korean refugees. And so the main point of this resolution would be to just ensure that, Southeast Asian countries, that when given the choice, the North Koreans will not illegally settle in their countries, but instead they want to seek asylum and resettlement where they're actually wanted. And so the ultimate goal is to make their journey less treacherous and to allow them to be less susceptible to human rights violations outside of North Korea, like human trafficking, and get the Southeast Asian countries to understand that due to their geographic proximity, it's inevitable that these North Korean refugees will continue to use the Asian Underground Railroad. However, I think with this UN resolution, we can have a way to ensure that the refugees will be reallocated to nations that are willing and wanting to provide them asylum. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, questions first in the back.
Is it me? Okay, yeah. How does Mongolia handle the issue? Is Mongolia willing to accept the asylum for the refugees? I've never heard that before.
Yeah, there was a period of time where Mongolia had connections in which they would accept some of the refugees, but I think now, recently in the last few years, they've been a lot more closed off. Both Mongolia, the Mongolian border and the Russian border closest to North Korea are extremely closed off in the last 10, 20 years, and that's why most of them go through Northeast China. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a question about what you mentioned previously and how the South Korean embassy in Vietnam kind of shrugged it off or took a long time to respond to Vietnam having North Korean refugees. What's your interpretation of why South Korea reacted this way, and also are there other instances of this happening in other Southeast Asian countries?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's important to clarify that it's not South Korea that acted this way, but specifically the South Korean embassy in Hanoi has had a history of being a bit slow, not responding to reporters, not responding to human rights groups, not responding to Vietnamese authorities. So it's more, I would say, an embassy issue there than it is the South Korean government, because as we know, the South Korean government is willing to take the refugees, and they obviously have a multitude of programs for them in North Korea. So I think it's more of a country-specific, embassy-specific problem. Yeah, and I honestly couldn't tell you exactly why. It just seems to be something that's just an issue there. Anyone else?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Omar. I'm a sociologist, and I've visited Southeast Asia a number of times. So it's really wonderful to have a fellow specialist in Southeast Asia in the room. And I really enjoyed how you provided a comprehensive overview of what's going on, and especially in neighboring countries. I'm originally from Iraq, and we've had issues along very similar lines for a long time. And it's a tricky issue. You did mention the United Nations. A lot of people have put a lot of faith in the United Nations, but a lot of people have not.
Yeah.
So it's an institution. It's an intergovernmental institution, and you know the reputation of governments and so forth, especially with the latest Gaza crisis and the horrors happening in that part of the world. So I'm wondering, when something is not in the news, people care less about it. But sometimes in order for something to get in the news, something really bad has to happen.
Exactly.
And I really hate it for things to happen to North Koreans that get them in the news because they're so horrible and atrocious. But there's got to be some way of strategizing media access, especially social media, like the way, for the first time in human history, people saw headless children in Gaza on social media. So maybe if you can provide your own thoughts on this, that would be great.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about media coverage. I think it's unfortunate, especially people tend to only talk about North Korea if one or if two things happen. one, if North Korea is doing some sort of nuclear testing, and two, if they actually had some of the refugees repatriated back recently. So the May 2024 case, that was, in the headlines, but maybe not necessarily mainstream media, but I know a lot of people that are China watchers that are focused on East Asia wrote a lot about the repatriation. So I think you're definitely right about media coverage, but I think that's exactly why I decided to do this topic and this talk today, because I think, if the media is not talking about it, then we can still talk about it. And you guys can post about this, and we can post on our social medias about it, and hopefully, get somewhere. And in terms of speaking on the UN, the reason I chose the UN is just because the reality is that, we can't get into North Korea. There's no way to actually deal with the situation happening inside feasibly. I mean, people have their own theories of how we could deal with North Korea, but none of that is happening right now. So for me, I think this is an issue that the international community can actually do something on, because this is actually not about North Korea. This is about what's happening outside of North Korea. So that's, why I did this, why I focused on it. But you're absolutely right. And obviously the conversation we're having today, maybe you guys would be more inclined to look up what's going on in North Korea after this and post about it and follow it, even if something super heinous isn't happening right away, because super heinous things are happening every day in North Korea. You just can't see it. So it's important to remember that.
Thank you for this beautiful lecture. When you mentioned the dual citizenship aspect of it all, do you see in the future South Korea and North Korea coming to terms to dissolve that benefit? Because it doesn't really seem to be doing either side any good. If I have dual citizenship, I can't go over there, and the other side definitely doesn't want to come over here, so what is the point? And who at what point is going to decide, okay, let's just not have that be part of the conversation anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that aspect actually has its roots way back in the Korean War. It's a pride thing for both countries, stating that we are the rightful government of the entire peninsula, on both sides. And so they do that in order to, make sure that they prove and what's the word I'm looking for? Like project legitimacy for their government, and it projects that the other government isn't legitimate. And so I would say that's where the dual citizenship situation comes from. But I will give South Korea the benefit of the doubt, is that they do that also so that it's much easier when North Korean refugees get into South Korea, and then the process is a lot easier that way. But it's in both countries' constitution that they are the rightful governments of everyone on the peninsula, born on the peninsula. Specifically for North Korea, it comes down to, I mentioned before, Juche ideology, and that's actually the tool of indoctrination that they use in North Korea. And the revolution that I was talking about actually is what's known as the revolutionization of the Korean peninsula. And that's been a doctrine that's been focused on in North Korea from the beginning up until now. And the point is so that basically they want to revolutionize the peninsula by taking over the entire peninsula and having it under communist Kim rule. And obviously that was more feasible back in the 50s when things were a little more hot. But it's still important that North Korea actually still keeps this as a part of their constitution, and most people don't actually know that. But that's also why they have the whole dual citizenship thing also. And in terms of both countries coming together, I think the thing is that it doesn't actually, it's not something that affects the relations with one another, because if the two of them were to come together and say, okay, well, we want you to stop dual citizenship, like, I don't know, that's not really going to do anything for either of them. The point is for, I guess, the people that make it outside of North Korea more so when they make it to South Korea. That's more of what it affects, because no one from South Korea is going to North Korea, so it doesn't really matter for their aspect at least. So thank you for the question. Yeah, that's my boss. Woo.
Thanks, Peter, for a wonderful talk. My question is, in terms of your recommendation for UN resolution, are there any analogous resolutions on refugees or like blocking repatriation for refugees from other countries. My sense is that if there was such a resolution to be tabled, China has a big stake in this in terms of blocking such a resolution, and I'm sure could get a lot of international support to block such a resolution because of their own senses, as you've laid out so eloquently. So yeah, are there any analogs historically for this?
So funnily enough, when I was doing this research, I didn't find anything like from the UN that specifically had a resolution about forced repatriation. I think because that's not, the honest truth is it's not as big of an issue in other places. Like this is just a very kind of niche situation. But yeah, it definitely would be something that China would want to block. But I thought of it because I think it's still something that could hold weight, that could be put forefront at UN General Assembly for the first time, because I don't think they've really addressed the issue in this light. So yeah, there's not really much precedent on that aspect. There's mostly just precedent on refugees, like obviously the Refugee Convention, all of the things that there's in the UN about the human rights and about like violations of human rights. And that's kind of the basis of the precedent for where I get the idea of the non-repatriation, because that's actually a thing that, like I mentioned in the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, there's the non-refoulement, which is also non-repatriation. So technically it's kind of already there, but UN countries have their own ideas, especially China, for saying why that's not good enough. And so maybe we do need something more, like a more specific resolution on this specific topic. But thanks for the question.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. So we know human trafficking is big business in South Asia, especially the Philippines. Some of them end up as far away as Brazil. And aside from normal human trafficking, they're getting caught up in slave labor, sex trafficking, and the organ and stem cell harvesting. In your research, did you come across any evidence that North Korean refugees are getting caught up in these networks as well, or are they mostly remaining in the countries that you mentioned in your talk?
I would say the main research that I've seen is them getting caught up in the countries that I've mentioned, but there's no telling, they could definitely be sold to those other aspects as well. I think the biggest thing is that it's the brokers networks that are the ones that both help and both harm North Korean refugees, right? So a good number of brokers will get them through and they get paid and they take them to the country they want to get to, but a good number of them will get paid and then just sell them off. So I think that's one aspect that I find a hard time finding a resolution for, because these brokers networks have to be unofficial, they have to be non-governmental because of the nature of the work they're doing. They're basically smuggling people, but smuggling people in a good way to get them freedom. So it is a little bit tricky, I would say. I do know that, especially with South Korea, they have a number of, especially religious organizations. One in Beyond Utopia was a pastor, and he would physically go and take them through Laos and Vietnam, like he would take them on the trek. And so I do think that it would be helpful if more of these refugees could get in contact with legit organizations that will actually help them. But obviously there are a number, these brokers can't be so public. They can't say, hey, we're the brokers helping people get through, so it leaves room for shady business, essentially, because it has to be so quiet. So yeah, it's really unfortunate, but I don't have exact details about other sex work and those type of things. But I do know China, Northeast China especially, and they're sold mostly as marriages because most of the men want children. And so that's what'll happen. But you have a question?
Yeah. What is the volume, I guess, of North Korean refugees, and what percentage of them end up getting repatriated back to North Korea?
So
to our knowledge.
Yeah, to our knowledge, it's actually dwindled down since COVID. So before then, there'd be I think over 100 kind of per year that, make it. And these are just numbers about who's making it to South Korea, right? So we don't have the specific numbers on who makes it to more northern China and them staying. And there's not really that many numbers on that. And in terms of percentage of who gets repatriated, we don't really know. If it's not on the news, like the China case, then we don't know. And most of the countries like to keep it hush-hush, obviously, because they don't want bad publicity. So there's no way of telling unless it gets, played on the news. And of course, North Korea doesn't want people talking about them anymore. So, they tried to keep things on the down low too, but yeah. But now, but just to finish the answering, as of right now, in the last 2 years, not many people have actually been able to escape, partly because the COVID restrictions were so high. Like they gave a law to shoot people on sight. And so yeah, it's only been, I think, in the teens in terms of people that are making it to South Korea that are like known as North Korean refugees in the last like 3 years. Yeah. Yes, my other boss, woo!
So you mentioned Mongolia, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand as the main places. It's not as though there aren't ways to get from China to South Korea, right? All of the ports on the Bohai, from Dalian to Qingdao have direct ferries, there are planes, there are lots of places. So what has taken place in China that meant that they've gone further afield, sort of China becomes a pass-through point rather than they go to China and get across? And secondly, given the description that you described post-COVID and decrease in refugees, do you think some of this decrease would be attributed to the changes in China's internal security because of the COVID controls and what they've kept in place since then? Is that kind of the biggest change, or is there something else that you think?
So actually, funny enough, the biggest change has not come from China, but it's come from North Korea itself. So part of the COVID restrictions also placed a lot of restrictions on the fishing boats and those sorts of more direct routes to get to South Korea because of the restrictions. But I would say that I definitely think the zero COVID in China had a lot to do with it as well. In terms of, I think, actually capturing, because there's also this element of there are a number of refugees that are illegally in northern China that actually, will stay or will be there for a while. Because like I mentioned, there are more ethnic North Koreans there. And so it actually had to do more with, because of the COVID situation, I think China started to want to capture more of them. So it's not like they don't know that a number of them are there, but it's about when they want to clamp down and capture more and send more back. And I definitely did think COVID had to do with that. But I think it really had more to do with North Korea because they really it's interesting that North Korea does go through eras where they'll let a little bit of black market. They'll kind of let some people in and out. They'll be a little more lax on the border. But in the last few years, it's been extremely, extremely strict. And both for the fishing, for getting straight to South Korea, but also going through northern China. But I think the northern China border has always historically been the one that's very porous. I mean, Russia too, but they kind of in the 2000s closed that down. But yeah.
Any other questions at this time?
Anything, questions, comments? We have 10 minutes if anyone has anything. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me ask a second question. Malaysia and Indonesia, I know you didn't include them. They do get a lot of refugees from different parts of the world, including all the way from Iraq, and they have various policies. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I don't know much about Malaysia and Indonesia because specifically I focused on the countries that related most to North Koreans. But yeah, and the reason why these specific countries are the ones that North Koreans actually go through is because, like I mentioned before, getting to Thailand is going through the route. Getting to Thailand is the main kind of thing for most of them. So that's why this is the route that they have to take, because they want to get to South Korea. That's why they don't often go to other countries and, just stay there and try to get refugee status there. It's because they at least know from what's the little information that's getting into North Korea, they at least know that South Korea is a safe haven and will take them. So yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't comment, but.
What about Chinese smuggling gangs? Are they involved in any way?
I think probably. I mean, I think the biggest thing with China and North Korea is that China is actually the ones that provide a lot for North Korea's black markets and those sort of things. So there's a lot of business that goes on there as well. So I know for sure Chinese smugglers, yeah. Yeah, they're the biggest ones that are, that have to do with actually like getting things into North Korea and that's type of business, yeah. All right, thank you so much.